Hey guys, today we're going over Fair Isle knitting. Fair Isle knitting is basically just two-color knitting, putting different colors in your knitting. For this one I did 3 different colors. I've got gray, red, and blue, but it's basically the same concept. You're using multiple pieces of yarn and knitting them to form a pattern, and it can be difficult sometimes. The ironic thing about Fair Isle knitting is that it is not very fair. So you have this beautiful, nice pattern side, but on the flip side, you're always gonna have a stranded side with these different stranded colors crisscrossing over each other. So this is why it's also called stranded knitting, because no matter what, you can have the most beautiful pattern on the front side. On the back, you're gonna have this stranded bit. Unless you're doing reversible knitting, which I do have a tutorial up for knitting a reversible scarf. And that way you can alternate your colors, and on both sides it's gonna be beautiful stockinette stitch, and you won't see this back side because it'll be hidden inside. That is a totally different tutorial though, so check that out if you want to. In this one, I'm just gonna be showing you my tips for how to do a Fair Isle knit and how to manage the different colors of yarn and not get too tangled up on the back side. There is another method of doing two-color knitting, and that's block color knitting. That's where you have a whole section of like one color and then a whole nother section of another color, and your yarn is pretty much totally separate. There's no crisscrossing of the colors except for on the edges to keep them connected. And I have done a tutorial of that before. It was an American flag tutorial that I did a long time ago. Everything I did was a long time ago now. But that's up there if you want to check that out. It's just kind of a different way of switching colors besides doing Fair Isle knitting. All you'll need for this tutorial are obviously your knitting needles and a pattern to follow, and then at least 2 different colors of yarn. So I'm just going to show you this project that I'm working on here. Where I'm at now in the pattern is it's calling for another set of 2 stars to go right here. So on this new row that I'm starting, I'm going to be knitting and then introducing the red back into it to build up 2 of these stars. And right now I'm going to be using blue and red. There is gray in here, but I've faded that out here on the bottom. I might show you how to put back in the gray, but it's basically the same process. So as I'm knitting, I don't really have any huge tips or tricks with Fair Isle knitting. The one thing I will say though is that if you end up with a big mess of like tangled yarn, which is inevitable, then I say you're on the right track. You're gonna have some messes of knitting, especially depending on the amount of colors that you're using. Things are just gonna get tangled no matter what. So I encourage you to just embrace the tangled yarn and kind of tease out what you need as you go along to it. I'm sure there are better ways of keeping track of things, but I just embrace the mess. So for here, I've knit sort of my 2 blue bits here for the border, and now the pattern that I'm following is calling for another piece of red for this stitch right here. So to do that, my red right now is currently, if you flip it on the back, it's about 3 rows back. It's right here. So we're going to bring this back up and use it to knit the next stitch. The only trick you need to follow is 2 things. You want to make sure that your second color is in the back still, so we don't want the blue to be in the front, otherwise it would cross over on my good side. We want to keep it on the back because we want it to cross over along the back. And to do the red, you just put your needle in through the stitch and you bring up the red yarn from the back and you knit it like normal. The one thing you do want to do is keep a lot of slack. You don't want to pull it too tight, especially right now because the red is about 3 stitches gone. You don't want it to be too tight right here because otherwise it will pinch your work together and it won't look as good. I mean, it'll look good because it's tight, but it'll create kind of a fold in your project. So I've done that red, and now it's time for another blue. So I'm just going to take my blue yarn, bring it around underneath the red, and just knit it again. And then I've got another blue stitch to knit. and then it calls for another red stitch. So put the needle in and then bring the red underneath and just knit it like normal. And you just want to be aware of how things are looking on the back side. And one thing you can do if you notice that the red is being pulled too tightly or something is you can actually take this big loop that's on the back and just pull that out to give it some more slack if you want. Or you can pull it tight if there's too much slack. So then my pattern is calling for the blue again, so I'm just going to knit 3 blue. And at this point when you're knitting different colors, like one after the other, like switching the colors a lot, then you don't really need to worry about making things too tight because the stitches are barely traveling far along the back. They're maybe just skipping one over the other. So you don't need to worry about pulling things too tight at this point. So for the rest of this row, my pattern just calls for 3 stitches of blue and then 1 stitch of red, and then 3 stitches of blue, then 1 stitch of red, 3 stitches of blue, 1 stitch of red, all the way to the end. So the only thing that has the chance to become too tight is the red skipping over these 3 stitches. So as I go along, I'm just making sure that I'm knitting the red with enough slack. I'm not doing things too tight. And then every once in a while, like I'll stop after this last blue, I'll turn the work around just quickly and glance at what it's looking at right now. So here's my row of red right here, and it's pretty good. There's not too much tension. It's actually kind of perfect amount of tightness and looseness. If I wanted to, I could pull these red loops a little bit just to make sure that there's enough slack, but I think it looks pretty fine. So I'm finishing my row here with my last bit of red right here, and then I've just got 2 stitches of blue left to knit. So get those finished, and now I can turn the work around. Once I'm all done with that, I like to spread everything out and make sure that I've got enough tension and enough slack between the colors so that nothing's being pinched too tightly. On the back side, you can do a little bit more inspection, just making sure that there's nothing being pulled too tight along these new strands of red that's being carried over. And I especially check right here where the yarn is jumping up multiple rows. So right here, this is making a big jump, so you want to make sure that there's enough slack there and that it's not pinching the fabric. So I'm actually going to pull this a little bit more. So I'm going to take some of the slack from these guys down here and just kind of carry it over to this side right here. And just pull that out a little bit, because when someone's wearing this and it's stretching, you want it to be able to stretch, basically. So to do the purl side of the knitting, if you're following a pattern, you're going to want to follow the next row up. So my next row up calls for a couple long bits of blue and then 2 stitches of red, and then I think 5 stitches of blue, then 2 of red, then 7 of blue, 2 of red, 5 of blue, 2 of red. So it's a lot of blue and not a whole lot of red, so there are going to be bigger spaces between the colors. So that's where I'm going to want to make sure, definitely, that nothing's being pulled too tight. So to start out, I'm going to take my blue, and it's just, for this border, I'm just doing a garter stitch on the border. So there's 2 stitches of the blue. And this is where the most important part comes in with the back side. You don't want to leave your yarn in the back. No matter what the stitch is you're doing, you always want to make sure that you pull it back to the back side, because if you leave it back there, it's going to be pulling across the front of your work and it's going to ruin your project. So always make sure, whether you're doing a knitting stitch or purl stitch, you pull this yarn back to the front where it was. So I think I got my point across. So now I am purling with this same blue, so I just bring it to the front. So in this case, it's not that big of a, it's not hard to remember to bring the the blue to the front because I have to purl anyways. So I got 5 stitches of blue, and now I'm going to do my red. So leaving my blue right here in the front, I'm going to pick up my red and bring it underneath the blue. So this is where things get tangled. Can you tell? This is just a headache. So I drop my blue and I pick up the red and I bring it underneath, and I'm going to knit 2 stitches of red with this, so, or purl 2 stitches of red. So there's 1 and there's 2. Cool. So I'm going to drop my red just where it is. I'm not going to bring it to the back or anything like that. Leave it there, and then pick up my blue underneath the red and start knitting again. So this calls for 5 stitches of blue. 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then next up is 2 stitches of red being purled. So again, I drop the blue where it is, and I pick up the red. This is where all that tangled yarn comes into play. I pick up the red and I bring it underneath the blue. So the red right now is 5 stitches behind. So for this one, I do want to make sure that there's a lot of slack for here. So how I do that is I just purl it like normal, but very loosely, not pulling anything too tight. So I make my purl, and then I just double check to make sure that the red right here has enough slack to stretch and it's not going to be pulled too tight. So I think that looks okay. Do one more red, and then we're ready for the blue again. The blue doesn't have to have so much slack because it's got only 2 stitches of red between it, so I'm not going to worry too much about having it too tight or too loose. And then my pattern calls for a big leap here, so there's 7 stitches of blue for this pattern, which is not the best idea. I think the main tip is not to have a huge gap between your colors. So 7 stitches is pushing it, because the red is going to jump over these and it's going to leave a huge bit of yarn that's leaping over those. And that poses the threat of making it too tight, or even if it's not too tight, it's just going to have a huge, big, like, thing of red on the back, and it's not going to look good on the back, which Fair Isle knitting never looks good on the back, but especially in this case it won't. But for me, I don't care. So I'm just going to knit these 2 reds, make sure that there's enough of a leap for the red, enough slack there to jump over the 3 blue stitches, and there is, and I'm going to go back to the blue here. So knitting 5 of the blue. These probably aren't the best colors for a tutorial. I'm looking at the monitor right now, and it's like way too brilliant of a contrast. Like the red is ridiculous. This is probably impossible for you guys to see, but I apologize in advance. So I did 6 on accident. Oopsie. Gonna go back here, pick this purl back up. Eek. Losing the stitch. There we go. And now I can do 2 reds here to finish up. So bring that over, make sure there's enough slack. 1 and 2. And I finish up with my blues. So purl for 3 stitches, I think, and then I knit for 2. Now I'm just talking to myself, mumbling. I'm so sorry. There's 1 and 2. Okay. So now turning it over just to see everything that we've done. This is the best part actually about Fair Isle knitting, is that you've done all this mess and you've dealt with this nasty backside that's just awful, and like you've got this tangled yarn here and it's just a mess, but when you turn it over to see what you've done, it looks wonderful. So straighten that out, and it does. You can already see the flower that's starting to form. We've got 2 rows of the red pattern that's starting to build itself back up. And it looks nice, it's uniform, it's not too tight, it's not too loose. The red is showing through the blue nicely, and it gives you the encouragement you need to go through the whole process again and do the next thing on your pattern. So that's Fair Isle knitting. There's not really any other tips that I can recommend you follow. It's just having the patience, I guess, to not go too crazy with the colors, and making sure you're crossing your colors under each other so that you don't end up with any holes or anything like that. And then keeping your yarn as detangled as possible, and when it gets tangled up, not letting it drive you too crazy. I will show you actually one more thing. I don't think I covered it very well, but the crossing under and over, especially when there's like a big gap, you don't want to form a hole in your knitting. So what you always want to make sure you do is you're crossing the new color underneath the color that you're switching out. So my yarn for the red is going this way to the right and over the top, and my yarn for the blue is going from the left and it's coming under the bottom. So that just makes sure that you're not knitting like 2 separate things. Like you're not knitting a separate blue and a separate red, you're knitting them together. And in this part in my pattern, it's calling for red and blue kind of intermittently. It's pretty even across the board. So when I do that, I like to hold my blue yarn continental style and my red yarn the other style. My mind is completely blanking. You can tell I haven't done knitting videos in a long time, but I can hold the red yarn throwing, there we go, throwing style. So I'm just throwing it from my right hand, and when I pick up the blue, my blue is just right there, and I don't need to like rearrange anything. I can just reach back up here. So now I can do continental for the blue, just switch right into it really easily. You still want to make sure though that you have enough slack and you're not making things too tight. But if you're switching colors a lot, that can be kind of a quick and easy way to do your knitting. So this time that is really all the tips I have for you. Just don't be too tangled. Make sure you're carrying the yarn behind the old yarn you're using. Don't pull things too tight. It's okay to continental knit and then also just throw knit at the same time if you want to mix up kind of the methods of knitting. But other than that, it's just having the courage to throw different colors into the mix. If you wanted to do a 3rd color, which I actually am doing with this project, with the gray that will eventually come back into this, you just do it the same way. You add it in and you make sure you're not doing things too tight. You're making sure things aren't getting too tangled, which they definitely will if you're doing 3 colors. So that is Fair Isle knitting. Be sure to leave me your tips and tricks in the comments, because I know for sure that I don't do it the best way possible. If you have any tips for keeping your yarn sorted out and not tangled up, or if you have any tips for making the backside not look quite as nasty as it's inevitably going to look, definitely leave those tips for me in the comments, and I'll for sure look at them, because I love Fair Isle knitting, but I hate dealing with the mess of the back and then just the tangled yarn. It just gets frustrating. But other than that, check out my other 2-color knitting tutorial that I'll have up, and I will see you next time.